Hello, Meg players, and anybody else who's listening out there. Tempted to do the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy bit at this point. The secret is to bang the rocks together, guys. Anyway, welcome to on that bizarre start. Welcome to another Meg podcast. We've got round to this one reasonably quickly this time, partly because we thoroughly enjoyed doing the last one on Cataphracts and Knights, and hope that you out there also enjoyed it. It certainly created a little bit of discussion on the forum about cataphracts, so that's got to be a good thing. Anyway, tonight, once again, we will be in the hands of Richard Jeffrey Cook. So welcome again, as ever, Richard, and also welcome Matt Haywood. So we've got the usual team.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So Richard, I presume from the reading he's been doing recently, suggested we look at some Chinese history. And he suggested we look at the period from the start of the 16 kingdoms to, well, as he said just when we were talking before this, towards the foundation of the Tang dynasty. It's quite a convoluted period, so we're going to see how far we get before Richard ties himself up in knots, possibly with the varying dynasties and states of the time. But it's a transition period essentially between the Han, or just after the end of the Han, and the Tang. So it's and with the Tang being one of the great dynasties of China, it's how we get there is very important. We will have some army lists from the period as ever. For your delight and delectation, all those and some book recommendations and figure recommendations will appear in the show notes with the blog. And Richard has produced, now don't be put off by this next bit, he has actually produced a little flow chart for the 16 kingdoms and northern and southern dynasties period, because in all seriousness, it is quite a complicated period. There's lots and lots of dynasties arising and falling. So Richard has produced, as I say, a little flow chart. You may want to dip into the show notes and look at it as Richard goes through. I'm sure Richard will be using his own flow chart to go through, and I will be looking at it to follow as well, because when I've read about this period, just go, who, how do they fit in? So anyway, with that introduction, hopefully you will find the flow chart of use and of interest, just to show you how complicated it is. I will hand over to Richard to take us through some history.
Thank you, Nick. And once again, hello, everyone. So I'm going to start this little session by covering some background in terms of general information that's useful when studying Chinese history, because I find that when I first started studying Chinese history, I was completely confused by some of the conventions and idiosyncrasies, perhaps, of Chinese history. So I thought it might be useful to cover these background bits first. Then I proposed to cover a bit about the structure and the way the kingdoms developed and the implications it has for the military and their armies. So let's start off with a bit about written Chinese, because it may seem obvious to some people, but written Chinese is actually morphosyllabic. There you go. There's an interesting word. Basically, each character of written Chinese actually represents a syllable. That's actually slightly an oversimplification, but we'll go with it for now. In modern Chinese, apparently a college-level educated Chinese person typically knows about 4,000 characters. And that's all well and good. I don't think ancient Chinese had that many characters per se, but the problem was that characters varied a bit in different parts of China. So, and it evolved over the years. So actually, modern Chinese, as we understand today, was largely standardized by the Communist Party in the in its early years. Chinese itself, obviously, that gives us a problem in representing it in Western characters. So you then get transliteration systems, which basically convert the Chinese sounds into words that we can write using the alphabetic characters. And as many will know, there are two main transliteration systems that are used. One, which is now pretty much superseded, is the system Wade-Giles. In researching this session, I actually found out that Wade-Giles is named after Thomas Wade, who produced the first system in 1859. And that system was further developed and refined by Herbert Giles in 1892. So that's why it's called Wade-Giles.
Didn't know that.
And the modern system of transliteration is known as Pinyin, which was developed by the Chinese Communist government and was actually adopted as an international standard. ISO 7098, if you want to quote your ISO numbers. This was developed in 1979. I think it got approved as an ISO standard 3 years later. So one of the problems, of course, we have is a lot of the older history books, and even history books written up until 2010, often use Wade-Giles when referring to peoples and kingdoms and so on, whereas almost all modern textbooks and places like Wikipedia generally will use Pinyin. So you get examples like HSUING-NU becomes Zhenyu, which is XIONG-NU in one word. So this obviously can make it even more confusing, particularly when you start off with bits of history like the 16 kingdoms. So yes, not only have you got to figure out 16 kingdoms, but sometimes they may not even be the kingdoms you think they are because of the way they're spelled. So boy, does that make life fun.
It's the 16 plus kingdoms.
Yeah. Another interesting aspect is actually the use of terms like emperor and king, and sometimes you'll see the term of duke. Best when you think of these terms is don't think about feudal Europe and the concepts we have, because they don't really match at all. The Chinese, from quite an early period, developed sort of different rankings for officials. And that's probably why you generally see these terms. Emperor typically is the top rank. When you get to king, it's basically people who reckon either they're not powerful enough to pull off the term emperor, or they're worried that somebody who's more powerful than they are will basically want to take them down a peg if they start using the term. So using the term emperor was pretty much a challenge, saying I'm going to be top dog here, and anybody else wants to argue with that, I'm quite prepared to fight them. So yes, you do have to be careful with those sort of terms. You'll see terms like princes as well used, who are generally blood relations, typically sons of emperors, but again, the term can be used very broadly and widely. So be careful when doing that. The other thing which took me a bit of a while to realise, and perhaps ought to be obvious, is Chinese names are I'm tempted to say back to front, but I suspect the Chinese would just argue that our names are back to front, in the sense that the clan name, or we would typically call it first, and then the personal name comes second. That's something to bear in mind if you're trying to figure out the rulers of the period. The other thing is that to bear in mind that up until the Sui dynasty, rulers in Chinese records were referred to, or are referred to, by their posthumous names, the names they were given actually after they died. And it's only from the Tang dynasty onwards that they then switched to using the temple name, which again is a name allocated typically after they died. Wasn't necessarily a name they would have recognized during their lifetime. In most of the cases, I'll actually be referring to any rulers by their personal names, because that frankly is a whole lot easier. Although once you get to the Tang dynasty, the convention often is to refer to the emperors by their emperor names rather than the temple names, rather than their personal names. So hopefully that will help a bit. The other background I'd like to give at this stage is actually to talk a bit about the geography of China, because this is actually very important to the history. China itself basically is divided geographically into two different sections, which are referred to as the North and the South. And this division actually occurs roughly along the line of the Hui River, Huai, and the Qinling and the Dabi Mountains. Qinling, Qinling, and Dabi, Dabie mountains. And this is broadly the line that reflects, that divides the dry, temperate north from the much warmer and wetter south. And the significance is that the north, they tend to grow wheat and millet. And in the south, it's wet rice cultivation that occurs. The south also tended to be more forested and difficult to access in this period of Chinese history, because it was still vast areas of it were relatively unpopulated. But in the areas where it could be cultivated, the south actually supports a very dense population because of the ability to grow multiple crops of rice at once. Other thing to bear in mind with rice actually is you don't actually have to flood the field to grow rice. The reason we think of rice as flooded fields is because actually it's a very efficient means of weed suppression. Rice can actually grow through flooded water, whereas most weeds can't. So that's actually why rice's fields are typically flooded. It's not because the rice actually needs the water to grow. It obviously needs water, but it doesn't need the fields to actually be flooded.
You
So,
know,
there's another
I just find that
factor
fascinating. It's something I'd never read it, never picked it up. That's fascinating. Amazing what you learn on a wargaming podcast.
Yeah. Anyway, there's probably somebody out there who say there are varieties of rice that do need flooded water, but anyway,
Well, yeah, one
I
thing I
won't
did pick
claim
up,
to be an expert.
yeah, one thing I did pick up once was there are a phenomenal variety of rices available. But yeah, it's
Indeed.
that's interesting. Sorry, Richard, just to you maybe mention this, but I think it might just be worth mentioning that China in the period we're talking about is not as big as the modern Chinese state as well.
Indeed. You very neatly introduced my next aspect. So I was going to talk briefly, yes. The important thing, of course, with China is also it's renowned for its two rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze. So the Yellow River is the more northern of the two, and Chinese civilization actually started in the eastern basin of the Yellow River, and then it sort of expanded from there. Ancient China of the period we're talking about actually corresponds to probably 80% of China, modern China, if you exclude the Tarim Basin and Tibet. So it actually extended far south as Vietnam, although Chinese control over Vietnam was fairly minimal at this period. It extended north towards what would be modern Inner Mongolia, but actually most of Inner Mongolia, as well as the current country of Mongolia, and areas of the Tarim Basin and Russia, were actually outside Chinese control at this time, or largely outside Chinese control at this time. The significant within the flow of the Yellow River is what is known as the Ordus Loop or Ordus Bend, which is a particularly significant area for Chinese history. It's a semi-arid area that the Yellow River flows north, then west, then south again before carrying on further west. And this area actually, from the Han period onwards, was actually quite often settled by nomads, who the Chinese actually had somewhat looser control over. And that's significant because it's from this area that a lot of the nomads that actually end up ruling much of China at this period actually originate from. Further south, we have the Yangtze River, and significant about halfway along the Yangtze River there are a series of gorges which made navigation from the upper level of the upper reaches of the Yangtze River to the lower river quite challenging, particularly if you wanted to try and travel upstream. And traditionally, all conquests of the lower part of China have tended to start from the Sichuan area of China, which is this sort of area covered by the more upper reaches of the Yellow River. So that has a bearing for our story later on. So our start of our story starts at the collapse of the Jin, which was a dynasty that managed to unify the three kingdoms, the Wei, the Han, and the Wu, by 280. From that date till 316 is the traditional dates where China was unified under the Jin. But unification is actually a very broad and loose term, because during this period we have an awful lot of upheaval. From 291 to 306, we have the War of the Eight Princes. Basically, central authority from the Jin dynasty is starting to collapse, and basically local aristocrats are trying to seize power. And the problem with this basically civil war of this period is that it leads to barbarian invasions. And we have the period from 304 to 316, which is known as the upheaval of the five barbarians. And these barbarians, if I can find a list, because I'm sure I'm going to get it wrong otherwise, included the Shanbei, the Jingnu, the Qiang, the Di, and I can't find the fifth. I'm sure somebody will. Anyway, there are 5 barbarian tribes. During this time, the Jin dynasty in 316 actually basically loses control of the north, and a branch of the Jin dynasty actually establishes a kingdom in the south, basically south of the Yangtze River, and that's referred to as the Eastern Jin. And they are the first of the 5 southern dynasties, starting with the Eastern Jin, which is from 317 to 420, the Liu Song, who go from 420 to 479. Then, and I think I may have got this wrong because I'm sure it's not the Eastern Jin from 479 to 502.
Ooh,
Or have I gone wrong?
It's usually army lists we edit on the fly, Richard.
Yeah, this is history. I'm editing on the fly. It wouldn't be the first time. Yeah, there's a lot of history here, which is why I can get confused. Yeah, it should say the Southern Qi from 479 to 502. I'll have to correct my flowchart. Apologies for that. Then the Liang from 502 to 557. And then finally the Chen from 557 to 589. So the South, in fact, throughout this period was the sort of consistent Chinese state throughout the time, whereas the North was constantly in upheaval. The Chinese South was pretty settled. As well as the Han Chinese, who settled particularly in the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, a lot of the inland areas, particularly away from the main rivers, were still occupied by Aboriginal peoples, in particularly the Man people. In fact, I mean, to give you an indication how many there were, a Chinese general Sun Qingzi actually may have captured as many as 200,000 Man, who he then enrolled into what were referred to as military households, basically lower class households who were obliged to provide military service. And those terms of service were extremely harsh. Basically, the system actually was prone to desertion because the terms were so hard. So by the end of the Liu Song, towards the 470s, actually that whole system of enrolling military households largely collapsed. And actually from that period onwards, rather than having sort of in hereditary military households, they switched to a system of voluntary enlistment of recruits. And they were referred to as Mu Bing, who they served for a specific term, and there were no hereditary obligations, so the son didn't have to be a soldier. And they became dominant in the armies of the Liang and the Chen later on. The best troops in the south actually were referred to as Northern Headquarters troops, which was actually a hangover from when the military was dominant in the north of China. And they were referred to as Beifu Bing. And they are first recruited in 376. And they actually were recruited from northern migrants, people who had fled the fighting in the north and actually arrived basically landless in the south. They become prominent in the early 5th century, disappear towards the middle of the 5th century. During this time, the southern Chinese armies are largely infantry. This is because actually the conditions in the south weren't particularly good for breeding horses, so they actually struggled to ever recruit the number of, or breed the number of horses. This contrasts very much with the north, where, I mean, the figures are quite amazing sometimes. 200,000 horses just held by one tribe in the north. Yes, it shows the difference between the two areas, which is basically built upon that difference in geography. So after the one of the significant things of the barbarian upheavals in the north is that the administration collapses. And this leads, it is quite interesting, in that late Han period, there are apparently over 10 million households in the north of China. In fact, that sort of number, I think, even extends as late as the Jin dynasty. But after that point, sometime in the middle of the 4th century, that figure has fallen to 2 million households. So only 20% of the number being recorded. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean the population fell to 20%. It means the administration could no longer keep count of them, keep track of them. Although vast numbers did migrate to the south, and there was a general drop in the population in the north as well. A lot of the barbarians that came in, and they're worth talking about, they came from largely the steppe areas to the north, northeast, and northwest of China, and so they were used to a much more herd raising lifestyle, not a settled agricultural lifestyle. And in fact, a lot of the settled Chinese who remained in the north actually moved towards the mountain areas, where you could build fortresses and you could defend the crops around the fortress areas. And much of the drier and wider river valleys actually become occupied by the pastoral barbarian tribes. And in fact, there are some descriptions of vast areas sort of falling into sort of marshland and reeds, purely because the irrigation systems are not maintained, so the ground floods. So you get this patchwork of drier areas where there's a lot of horse raising and steppe tribes, abandoned areas which are not maintained and get overgrown and flooded, and then mountain areas where settled peoples continue to grow crops. So the Jin dynasty collapses in the north, and very quickly some of the barbarian tribes start to take over. So amongst the first kingdoms that we see are the later Zhao and the former Zhao. And these are kingdoms set up by Xiongnu leaders who had previously actually been employed by the Jin. They were originally sort of remnants of the southern Xiongnu, who had been organized into 5 divisions, and basically, with everything falling around, one of their leaders, Louis Juan, declares independence, and then other leaders sort of are attracted to join him, and he establishes one of the first 16 kingdoms. The fall of Chang'an, which was the Western Jin capital, it's located sort of up, sort of west of the Yellow River, is the sort of marking point where everything starts to fall apart, and this is where these kingdoms first start. Along with that, we get in 337 the establishment of the former Yan kingdom, whereas the later Zhao and the former Zhao basically occupy the area around the Yellow River. In the former Zhao in particular occupy the area of the Yellow of the Order Spend, and Chang'an's just basically to the south of that Order Spend. But the former Yan, they actually established up in very much in the northeast of China, in the sort of border area next to Korea. So they established that territory in 337 and actually hold on to it until 370. All this division actually then sort of comes to gather again a bit with the establishment of the former Qin dynasty, and that they start around 351, and they actually survive right through until it all falls apart in the 380s, and the dynasty formally collapses in 394 at the Battle of Feiqiao. I don't know how to pronounce these. Feiqiao.
Yeah.
And that's yes, good luck with that. And yeah, this is when everything falls apart into small kingdoms. So you get the later Yan, the later Qin, the Western Qin, and the later Liang. The later Liang established themselves in the northwest and actually extend almost into the Tarim Basin. Moving sort of through, you then get the former Qin. Then heading sort of further east, you get the later Qin. And then you get through to the later Yan, who occupy the area closest to the coast. Maybe worth briefly mentioning, to the Chinese of this time, the coastline they actually regarded largely as a wet desert, in that they didn't really see any huge value in the sea, because just beyond the sea there wasn't anything of any value or worth. So right. The Chinese at this time are very much a river. In terms of naval, they're very much focused on the rivers rather than on the sea. And from a administrative point of view, they regard the sea almost as being a worthless desert, which is very much a different focus from our sort of Mediterranean classical history type idea. But that's sort of quite interesting as well. All right. It all then gets very confusing from here, and on the flowchart you'll see that there are a whole zigzag of arrows going in all directions.
I'm laughing. I'm looking at it now.
Just about summarises the history, basically. All of these kingdoms really struggle from a point of view. These are barbarian steppe warriors essentially imposing their control over settled areas. Most of them actually like to adopt Chinese sort of customs and dressing and use Chinese officials to administer the settled peoples. But essentially, they were a military which ruled the country, dominating a civilian settled population. And the problem with this was that if you didn't have a strong leader controlling, then quite frankly, the army was quite prepared to choose a new one. And so you basically held on to your throne by being a strong leader. And as soon as a strong leader died, there tended to be infighting amongst the relations as to who would be the successor. And a lot of the nominated successors actually get assassinated or defeated in battle, which is why the kingdoms proliferate.
Sorry, Richard, because that does sound to me to really sort of sit with the steppe origins of these people, because it's not dissimilar to what happens with the great steppe empires and whatever as well. They're because if I remember right, generally the steppe people, a ruler's brother was likely to be the one who inherited, but it was sort of institutionalized rebellion almost. Anybody could have a punt.
You're exactly right. I mean, this does occur with a lot of the steppe nations, and I could probably do an equally long podcast on all the steppe nations at this time. But yes, you are right. Rather than the idea of the son inheriting, the steppe cultures had this idea of quite often a brother inheriting, presumably because a lot of them died fairly young, because it was a pretty vicious place. And a brother was likely to be more of a mature age to take over than a son would be. So I suspect that's why that sort of custom became established. And yes, it doesn't sit particularly well with the Chinese, who have the idea of dynasties being inherited from father to son. So yes, so for example, the later Liang kingdom very quickly splits into the northern Liang. The northern Liang themselves have a rebellion, so you get the western Liang, which is interesting, is one of the few Chinese dynasties of this period. But you also have the southern Liang, and then the southern Liang get conquered back by the western Qin again. So it all goes round in circles. Yes, interestingly, you also have the Jia who come along, and they actually they're actually sitting in the Sichuan sort of area, and they actually get conquered by the Song. One of those rare occasions where one of the southern dynasties actually takes territory from a northern kingdom. But over in the sort of east, yes, the east side of the country, the later Yan suffer from the same sort of problem, in that they split when the later Yan get conquered, or parts of the territory get conquered, some of them go off and found the southern Yang kingdom, and then what's left of the later Yang kingdom collapses, and that becomes the northern Yang kingdom. So, but there again, it's a case of it's different. Usually, it's either an obscure relation or an official who seizes power and takes over and becomes these dynasties. So yeah, it all becomes a confusing model. The saviors of this, and the dynasty that eventually almost unifies China in the north anyway, is the Northern Wei dynasty, which originally starts around 383 and actually survives in various states and forms right through to 533. So that introduces a measure of sort of unity in the north. It takes a long time before, I mean, the last of the kingdoms that get absorbed into the Northern Wei is actually the Northern Yang in 439. So it actually takes the whole process about 55 years to unify the north. And that's all going swimmingly until the dynasty collapses in a civil war in 533, and the Northern Wei split into two halves, basically. The Western Wei in the west, surprise, surprise, and the Eastern Wei in the east. And these carry on till the 550s, where again both states actually collapse so the Western Wei become the Northern Zhao, and the Eastern Wei become the Northern Qi. And I mean, these states actually have a big bash at each other in the sort of 540s, and neither side can really make much progress against the other. And it's sort of a stalemate that doesn't really get resolved until the Sui dynasty come along in the 580s, and the Northern Zhao essentially take over the Northern Qi, start making big inroads in the south, and then the Sui, who's basically an official in the Northern Zhao era, and whose name I don't know if I have, Yang Jian. He actually was a member of the military aristocracy. He actually, his daughter was married to the emperor, so she was an empress. And then when everything sort of collapses, he seizes power, and from the 580s through till the 614 period, we have the Sui dynasty, who who basically in the late 580s, they sweep down the Yangtze River. They, by this time, and this shows the sort of numbers involved, they actually have 5 armies involved in the invasion of the Chen. Basically 4 armies sort of controlling the gorges and the banks of the river, allowing the fleet to sweep down, and the 5th coming from the north, essentially, as almost as a diversionary route to eventually seize the Southern Dynasty's capital at Luoyang, Luoyang, which is basically central in the lower part of the Yangtze River. Figuring out where all these places are and how it all relates is a whole exercise in itself. So where it goes wrong for the Sui dynasty is actually when they try and take Goryeo, the Korean kingdom. Basically, the first invasion is in 598 and was a sort of tentative probe that gets repulsed. The last Sui emperor then gets it into his head that he must conquer Goryeo, and there are in 612, 613 and 614 3 very ill-advised and ill-prepared invasions each of which result in disaster. And it's this lack of military credibility that leads to the collapse of the Sui dynasty and the eventual rise of the Tang. From that period through the Sui to the Tang, actually, there are 9 dominant warlords, and it's eventually the first Tang emperor, and more particularly as his son Li Shimin, who actually successfully unifies the empire again. The interesting thing with the invasions with Korea, which is actually it was logistics that led to the main failure of these invasions. The problem of actually getting enough supplies over the mountains, across the rivers to the Goryeo Kingdom, because you're talking a distance of quite a few hundred miles. And the problem was, if you carried the provisions on carts, by the time you actually reached the battlefront, the cart drivers had eaten all the supplies.
Yes.
The obvious way to supply the army would have been by sea, but again, it shows the weakness actually of the Chinese kingdoms, that they were, although they were focused very much on supplies for rivers, and although they made attempts to conquer the control the seaway to Korea, they never established a successful, reliable supply route. And that's partly because actually you've only got about 4 months of the year in that part of Asia in which to campaign and supply successfully, because the 6 months of winter, it's very stormy and cold, and it's difficult to maintain a regular supply of provisions. And then for 2 months in the summer, you have a heavy rainy system, which again makes navigation equally difficult. So it was that failure that actually caused the biggest challenges. And it's actually noticeable that the Tang as well really struggle. All the major Tang defeats, when they're on their really successful expansion period, are actually suffered in the northeast against the Koreans. I just want to touch actually on some of the military developments during this period, because the thing which starts with the Western Wei and Northern Zhao and develops eventually into the territorial soldiery, the Fu Bing of the Tang dynasty, which is part of the reason the Tang were so successful, is the idea of these territorial troops. You sort of supply basically this idea that they are full-time professional soldiers. They are supported by the farmers, which are exempted from taxes, unlike the rest of the population, but provide the sort of military arm, which is then rotated through the capital, which becomes a very important part of the Tang system, so that no warlord can retain control of the same troops for too long a period, because the troops are always being rotated around. And only for campaigns, and only under the direct control of the emperor, can an army be raised and moved. And in fact, if you sent as little as 10 troops without the authority of the central army, and ultimately the emperor, the punishment for that was actually decapitation. So that's quite a harsh penalty. So and the way to the way they enforced this was that there were two portions, one held by the regional commander and one held by the central bureaucracy. And until the two portions were joined together and presented to an army commander, he could not move his troops. So yes, it was they were apparently molded and shaped like the shape of a fish. So one was the head of the fish and the other was the body, and it slotted in. And because they matched perfectly, that was how the commander knew that it was a genuine order from the emperor and not a fake order.
Oh, right.
So again, all these interesting things and aspects you get. How are we doing? Yeah, I mean, I think I'll briefly actually touch upon the nomads to the north, because although I didn't really discuss it in any detail, the reason the Northern Way are so successful and actually unify the north of China is because they were actually one of the rare kingdoms in the 16 Kingdoms period that was initially established outside of China. They were a steppe kingdom that actually expanded into China. So they had resources from the steppes, which many of the other 16 Kingdom period kingdoms didn't. Probably the most significant people in the steppes themselves were actually the Rurans and the Ruran Khaganate. They are believed to have been proto-Mongolic Donghu of origin, and the Donghu were also ancestors of the Xianbei, who were actually provided a lot of the barbarians that invaded in the upheaval of the barbarians and provided quite a few of the dynasties. In fact, the Northern Way themselves were actually a Xianbei dynasty. They actually got into a conflict in the 6th century with the Teal. I do not know how you pronounce these, whether it's Tiele. It's Tiele. Sometimes it's spelled Chile, so Chile. But so it's, presumably it's something like that, Chile or something. Sometimes they're also referred to as the Xiantuo, Xueyantuo. And in fact, they also are ancestors or related to the Uyghurs, who actually much later on established kingdoms and the Khaganate. And during that time, a Turkish leader by the name of Buman Kagan, he actually became aware that Chile were planning a revolt against the Ruran, and he actually issued a preemptive strike against orders. His reward for this was he was given a Ruran princess, but he was then told, "Don't do it again. You disobeyed orders," and this pisses him off basically. So he actually then allies with the Western Way, and he actually marries a Chinese princess at this point. Not having you were allowed, they didn't have rules that said you had to have a single wife, so why not? And he then goes and defeats the Ruran. He dies a few months later. I did mention life was harsh on the steppe, but his son, Mugen Kagan, actually then goes on, takes control of the Ruran Khaganate and actually goes on to expand westwards and defeats the Hephthalites in the 570s. But again, the whole divisions tend to occur, and the Turkic Khaganate, or Gokturks as they're known, Gokturk Khaganate, then divides into the Western and Eastern Turkic Khaganates. And it's during this period that the Avars appear in the West and interact with the Byzantine Empire. I mean, the Gokturks themselves actually get as far as Crimea by the 590s and do interact with the Byzantine Empire. So yes, so that's a bit of, I mean, there are various other nomad tribes you may come across. The Tuyen, Tuyuan, Uhun. They were Janbei people led by Murang Tuan, so that was his personal name, who got established after the Janbei state disintegrates around the 280s. And they subjugate many of the native Chang peoples, and they actually establish an empire north of the Tarim Basin that actually survives through to the 670s. You also get the Kumoji, and they're also descendants of the Dong, who and they are linked to the Khitans. Both they and the Khitans, who appear much later on as a major dynasty in the Khitan Liao, they were defeated by the Northern Wei in 388. And they and the Khitans tend to be dominated by the Turks during this period, which is why they aren't a major power. So yes, so not only plenty of Chinese kingdoms, but plenty of nomads that you may come across as well. Yeah.
Just as messy outside China as inside.
Indeed. So the other aspect of the military, which I suppose was what led me to do the research for this podcast, is actually during the 16th Kingdom period, right through to the Sui dynasty, the main strike force of these armies are their cataphracts. And so armored horsemen first appear in the Xiongnu. So they appear to have originated in the northeast area of Manchuria, Korea, that sort of area. We're not exactly quite sure what drove this change, but yes, they first appear and were a gift of 900 sets of horse armor, I think it is, were gifted to in 312, I think it's right. Again, there's this theory that the stirrup was involved, although I must say that's somewhat, I think it's not convincing argument. I think the stirrup may well have been a separate independent development. Yes, the cataphracts appear, the numbers of cataphracts seem to have been fairly substantial. You have to be very wary of numbers. I mean, a good example is in 383, Fujian is supposed to have raised an army of 270,000 cavalry and 600,000 infantry for the Battle of the Fei River. I think that is a hugely distorted number. And it may well be a lot of the infantry actually would be labourers who were there driving carts, carrying supplies, digging trenches and all the rest of it. And in fact, a majority of the fighting force would have been cavalry, who would have been a mixture of these cataphracts and then poorer sort of light cavalry, the sort of flexible or skirmish cavalry that we would associate with our War Games armies. But quite a lot of the kingdoms, the cavalry would have been made up of multiple contingents from different original tribal backgrounds. The steppe tribesmen weren't, there wasn't the idea of nationality in the same sense there is today. So if you were a powerful leader with a whole bunch of nomads and another leader was more dominant, you'd quite happily work for him and you'd be treated as if you were running your own sort of vassal kingdom in that regard. The infantry during this period seemed to be a mixture of crossbowmen, archers, swordsmen, and sometimes spearmen. And how it all related to each other is anybody's guess. I think it's probably fair to say.
They're just there.
Yeah, the infantry, as I say, Chinese infantry get used even from quite early on in the 4th century, but the bulk of the armies until much of the 540s period is still primarily armored cavalry and light horse archers. It's probably worth mentioning the swordsmen. The swords this time seem to have been up to 4'6" in length. I don't know how that compares with with the later period where I think they get to even longer lengths, and
some do.
Probably arguably are possibly two-handed cut and crush type classification. I think that might be generous for this period. I suppose it's also worth mentioning, of course, this is the period where in the southern dynasties in 554, the Liang tried to use elephants, not particularly successfully. And as a result, China never really seems to adopt elephants as a, certainly not like the Hellenistic Greeks, or their attitude was probably much more like the Roman attitude, which was these things are a positive danger.
Yeah. We've seen them, we've beaten them, we gave them a bit of a go. Yeah, no.
Okay, so I hope that's been of some help and information. It is a confusing period, but again, it is one that has its own interesting stories, and is quite rewarding when you sort of get your head around them.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Richard. Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I have read some bits about this period, and yeah, just looking at the flow chart, I think just a glance at the flow chart does almost say it all, really. It is a very chaotic period for at least the first half of that period until the Northern Way. In the north, it is. The south, as you pointed out, is a lot more. There's more of a progression through a more limited number of dynasties.
Indeed.
But, yeah, sitting in the forests and the jungles of the south, where the northern cavalry doesn't work so well until the Northerners decide, let's use boats.
Yeah, it's the North had the greater resources if it was unified. The challenge was unifying the North and then being able to take advantage of that, because the southern defences built around the Yellow River were quite substantial. But if you could sweep down and override those defences, then it was there for the taking.
Yeah. The Yangtze, not the Yellow.
Yangtze, sorry, apologies.
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry,
it's easy to get your rivers confused.
Oh, absolutely. It is that. So yeah. So now you've read through all that. Just an inevitable question is: do you think our army lists in MeG are broadly okay for this, or have you spotted anything out there you think, oh, that there's any omissions, or you think, oh, that's possibly a bit iffy?
I think broadly they're fine. There are a few detail. One of the things I think is wrong is the D list, DI in the Three Kingdoms, which I think should probably have more infantry and less cavalry, and the later Chiang, which probably should be the reverse, more cavalry and less infantry. You can, but the basic classifications you can always argue over. Possibly the proportion of lighter skirmishing cavalry to cataphracts. Maybe we're a bit generous in the proportions of cataphracts that you can have. But again, you face this often problem in that some of the armies appear to be incredibly small, just 1,000 cavalry or something, and yet at other times you hear accounts of hundreds of thousands. So trying to grasp the true numbers is incredibly difficult. But in many ways, they had the same logistical problems that armies elsewhere had. So I would be very suspicious of any individual army that was more than, say, 70 or 80,000 tops. But certainly by the Sui dynasty, they're able to raise 5 or 6 of these armies. So you're talking, various estimates in the Tang period suggest the Tang were able to field anything up to 600,000 across their entire empire. But I still hold the opinion that it's unlikely any army exceeded 70 or 80,000 at tops, and many of them actually, because of the logistical requirements, would have been 10,000 or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, especially cavalry heavy armies, because I think you certainly mentioned it in the last podcast we did on cataphracts. The water requirements for horses are very high.
Absolutely,
and as are the fodder requirements. So you already mentioned about the carts. If you go a certain distance, the draft animals and the drovers eat what the cart can carry.
Yeah. So well, steppe tribes typically had to keep on the move, because once you eat the grass in one area, you then have to move on, and it takes quite a few months for the grass to recover. So you actually end up having to move from area to area along sort of major rivers, or else you sort of run out of water as well. So there's that constant rotation of tribes. And in fact, one of the ways the Tang effectively fight some of the nomads is basically to strip the grass away from areas on the traditional nomad routes, which disrupts their patterns, and that causes infighting and all the other squabbles that the Tang later take advantage of.
Great stuff. Okay. Well, again, thank you very much for that, Richard. That's just, hope you enjoyed doing the reading for it.
Indeed.
Yeah. And I have to say, since you brought this up, I've gone back and started to read some stuff on this on the, certainly around the Tang anyway. I didn't have the commitment to go back to the 16 kingdoms, quite frankly. This long litany of names. Matt, I don't know if you've got any thoughts at this point before we jump into army lists.
I'm desperately trying not to say something like who, what, why.
Oh,
sorry.
But you just did.
Yeah, I just did. I couldn't resist. Absolutely fascinating. It's one of those periods that I think is a rabbit hole for me, so I just don't go near it. I'm happy to use the lists and play them, but listening to the history is great. But no, I couldn't stick my head into that particular, because I'd never come out, I think. And anyway, I don't need another language that I can't pronounce, so that's another reason not to go near it. No, that was excellent. I really enjoyed that.
There was one thing I would say: if you are reading about this, I'd probably try and stick to fairly modern works as your basis, for the one reason Richard mentioned at the beginning is the transliteration systems, because I do. I'm sure you had it, Richard, going through this. Is if you swap you're reading one book that says Pinyin, and then you're reading something in Wade Giles, your brain fries, or mine does anyway. So I pretty much try and stick to anything that's just Pinyin these days, because it's more accessible.
There's a good example in the Battle of Shrewsbury, which in I don't know if I can find it, but in Wade Giles, it's SSUI hyphen SHU or something, and in Pinyin it's SHU SUI. So yeah, you suddenly think, are these two the same things? It's even worse if you read Beckwith and the Tibetan Empire, because he often puts names in Tibetan, which means you're then trying to figure out, are these the same people that are elsewhere? So yeah, you almost need a dictionary to translate some of the names across. I think in the army list actually some of the names are translated, just to help people along a bit.
It is, yeah. Anyway, it's probably let's jump to an army list. We'll start with Matt, because he's been quiet while just thinking up his terrible pun.
Yeah, it took me the best part of an hour. So yeah.
Yeah. Was it worth it in the end? Really?
Probably not. But you know.
Okay. But the other reason to start with Matt is Matt's gone for an army list sort of at the start of this. Actually, it's just before the 16 kingdoms, but it sort of fits into the same post Han area. So I'll just hand over to Matt to introduce his army list and take us through it.
Thank you. I hadn't realised I'd slightly precursored the period, because I mean, I have to admit, I looked at the flowchart, went, so panicked and went early. Right.
Well, they are on the flowchart in sort of precursor.
Right, well, that's okay then. As long as I made the flowchart, I don't feel too guilty about it.
So. We're okay.
We're in the right area. Right. I'm assuming it's the we, is it? Before
I think Richard said way, because the name cropped up with the later one. But yeah, let's go with the way.
That is the way. Okay.
Yes, because we get more puns in to irritate any people who can't pronounce the Chinese word properly. Of course, just on that, we're talking about medieval Chinese names. So, even Pinyin is made for Mandarin, really, Chinese, I think. Anyway, I'll stop rabbiting on and let you go on with the way.
Thank you. Right, Way, Three Kingdoms. It's from the Three Kingdoms book, I believe, 4303. Date 210 CE. Terrain you can have is standard coastal and mountains. It's typical professional set of generals, so I went with 4 competence, because it really was one of those vanilla average armies, I think, was what I was looking at. Right, so sorry, PBS is 7. Scouting's 3, breaks on 6. I didn't quite get to 10k. I'm 18 points short. 12 UGs, 4 for deployment, obviously. Right, it's reason I picked it is it's a slightly different from a lot of the Chinese lists, which are polearm based. This one actually allows you to have some long spear, and I thought, well, let's give it a whirl and see what we get. So, having mentioned the long spear, I'll now start with the cavalry, just to be contrary. So 2 blocks of 2 tugs, of heavy cavalry. Now the cavalry is also reasonably interesting, because it's not the typical Chinese cavalry, I don't think. They are formed loose, average, protected, experienced bow, short spear with melee expert. So 2 lots of 6 of those. You've then got the state-like cavalry, which honestly I've made quite a state of them, but they're cavalry formed, it's the night for it, what can I say? Cavalry formed flexible, average, unprotected, experienced bow, and I've made them combat shy. 2 tugs of 6. That makes them really quite cheap, and frankly I don't want to be fighting anything with them, so combat shy fits. Then we get on to what I would essentially call the fighting part of the army, which is you've got your vaguely traditional Chinese volunteers, who are infantry formed, flexible, superior, protected polearm. They can't have long spears, so they've stuck with the polearms. 8 of those, so a single tug of those. You've then got the elite fighters with Mao, I'm assuming it's pronounced, but again, I apologize if it's wrong. which are infantry, drilled, flexible, average, protected, long spear, 8 of those. You can then upgrade them to superior, so there's now another 8, but they're superior, protected, long spear. You've then got upgraded elite crossbowmen, infantry, drilled, loose, average, protected, skilled crossbow, 6 of those. You've then got upgraded elite archers, infantry, drilled, loose, average, protected, skilled bow, 6 of those. And then to balance all these upgraded elites, you've then got the conscripts, who are, well, they had to be there somewhere. Conscript close fighters, also with Mao, and they are formed, flexible, poor, protected, long spear, 6, because that's the minimum you have to take. And then 12, 2 blocks of 6, sorry, conscript crossbowmen, who are as bad as you can get them. Infantry, formed loose, poor, unprotected, unskilled crossbowmen, combat shy. 2 blocks of 6 of those. And that's it. 12 tugs, no skirmishers. That's your lot, really. I think you probably pray to fight in a lot of terrain, use the cavalry to annoy, and hope the combination of long spear and archers wrecks somebody's day. There you go.
No skirmishers, a bit unusual for you, Mr. H.
Yes, as I was working through the list, I actually decided I preferred to have another unit of the state like cavalry than, which probably got me 2 blocks of skirmishing infantry. Because, I mean, the bits that I want to shoot, and so yeah, can't make my mind up on it, to be perfectly honest. But it was because of the long spear. Basically, I wanted to try it and see if you could get something slightly different out of it.
Yeah, I think I've looked on occasion. I've looked at this one for exactly that reason, for the long spears. You know, there's something about superior drilled, flexible long spear that's actually quite nice. You only have 8.
Yes, you can have up to 16 of the elite fighters, half of which can be superior. The list does allow you to take another block of average long spear flexibles, I think, but I didn't have the points for it after I paid for all the minimums. You'd have to lose one of the heavy cavalry to get it.
Yeah, and you want those volunteers as well, don't you? Another superior infantry unit. Yeah. Yeah. These early Three Kingdoms ones. It's the compulsory conscripts, isn't it? That you go.
Yeah.
It's yeah. You know, I think you say about skirmishes. I'm joking about the skirmishes. I'm just wondering, just one state like cavalry and 2 blocks of skirmishing foot archers.
It could well be. As I say, I was torn. That was the choice I'd make, but yeah, they do it new.
Yeah,
I would have gone with the two skirmishing foot and dropped one of the skirmishing cavalry, I think.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I don't think you affect the PBS and scouting doing it that way either. So so you stay on 7-3. So
yeah, and you said the fighting stuff's the infantry. Those heavy cavalry are capable enough. They're not exactly going to flatten anything in the charge, but they're melee expert.
Oh yeah.
They're actually similar to the Tang cavalry, the Touge, which I've used on plenty of occasions, and they're more than capable of holding their own against most troops.
And they just save a few points over if they were superior but not melee expert as well. So I've in some ways I've because of that, and obviously it depends on the army and what you can get with the points you save, but I've sort of prefer average melee expert to superior. But that's it's not a hard thing. It's not an absolute, and certainly if you're in an environment with quite a lot of skilled shooters about, the superior not being shot up so much helps over average. So they're good value, basically. Basically 150 points a base.
Yeah.
Experienced bow, short spear, melee expert. Can't knock them. I think it's quite a solid army,
Yeah,
Sorry,
I
Richard,
sort of regard it as a sort of 9 tug army with the brakes on an extra one because of the conscripts. Because I can't see they're going to be appearing much in the front line, but the rest of what you've got is very solid. Yeah, I don't. I haven't been looking at the military of this period, so I don't know how good how accurate the army list is.
I've got one book on it, and basically it boils down to the armies of the time had a sort of a smallish core of really good troops and a huge mass of really quite bad troops. So I think the army list, we've probably got one of those where if you were being picky, there's you can probably take more of the good troops than strictly would.
Yeah, but
it's all
I
that
think
mix.
The logic of that is that actually what a lot of the poor stuff doesn't get to fight. It's the logistics and all the rest of it. So
absolutely, I think it's
so I don't have a huge problem with that.
No, I remember when I sort of read this book and thought, well, yeah, so looked at the list and then thought, well, and there's probably very large numbers of the conscripts allowed if somebody wanted to sort of take the minimum good stuff and maximum conscripts to go for this huge army of the enemy will blunt their swords before they break them sort of approach.
Oh yeah, you can have 48 of the conscript close fighters, 32 of crossbow, and you can even throw 32 archers into the mix as well if you want to.
Well, yeah. So yeah,
okay.
I think
that's probably plenty then.
Yeah. I think it's one of those where the army list works, doesn't it? These army lists have to work in game, and you can basically say yes, there are a lot more conscripts, but they're off table because they don't actually add anything, and we don't want to get to that. The killer and filler that DBM had.
Yeah, the other thing I don't know, I must admit, I'm not totally sure about is the flexible classification for the infantry.
I think there's I think classification for Chinese infantry is a whole subject to itself.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll leave that for another time.
Yeah, yes. I mean, I'm tantalising that because I know some of the earlier texts are very clear that, I think it's earlier texts anyway, that there are infantry that really can't stand up to cavalry. And we talk about the broad scope of it. If you remember back to the fog list, they were all loose formation to make them a bit vulnerable to cavalry. And that was the reason for it.
Yeah.
But obviously MeG is a different game, different interaction. So, but I think it's quite a big thing. It's difficult. So some of the earlier ones are talking about infantry needing caltrops and ditches.
Well, this army, all the infantry can have barricades. Literally all of it. Trust me, I was tempted, but then you take one look at it and go, "Get out!" You're not coming to a competition again.
Of course, you were tempted.
Yeah. Well, the conscripts can have it, and they can, and they're the combat shy conscripts with barricades. It was shocking to think about. So yeah, I banned myself from taking any barricades in this army.
And 80 bases of conscripts with barricades sitting there. Not the most exciting army to fight with, I would have thought.
You're guaranteed that the first thing you'd fight would be a Shan army with 12 superior elephants, and then you'd go, I spotted a problem.
Yeah. On the other hand, I bet we could all think of at least one person out there who would be tempted to do it.
Oh yes. Yes,
but no names, no pack drill. Okay, but yeah, it's solid enough army, that one. Might be interesting to try it actually at some point. I think it could be really quite interesting in a sort of, if you like, a Han period theme, Han and the immediate aftermath, because it's sort of following on from the Han.
I think it'll be narrow. I think that'll be its biggest problem.
Yeah,
although
possibly.
A lot of the foot are drilled though, so they actually might get themselves out of a lot of mess quite quickly.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's solid enough. Solid enough. I'm actually going to ask Richard to do his before I do mine on the ground, just on chronological order, not because I think mine is the highlight of the day.
Just to catch me out because I'm not ready for it.
Oh, I'll do
hang
mine.
on, I'll
Richard.
get it there.
Are you sure? Because it doesn't have to. I literally just went, oh, that's the next one in chronological order.
Let's find it. Sure it's here somewhere. Shanbei Kingdoms, wasn't it?
It was the Xianbei Kingdoms, yes.
Here we come. Okay, so this is list 4306. So I dated this 369. So that should correspond, if I can bring up my flow chart.
With the former Yan, I think.
With that seems plausible.
I can only say off the top of my head because I've got a list of the former Yan.
Okay.
And I think I choose 369 as well.
So anyway, so yes, standard coastal mountains is your terrain. This one comes with a poor fortified camp and a D ally. So yes, this is basically the alliance that was occurred in 369. So it's former Yan with former Qin allies, basically. So it's got three competent professional generals and a talented ally. Basically, fairly sort of regular stuff if you're using professional generals. It has 11 tugs and 1 sug. The tugs are best cavalry, which are formed close, superior, armored horse, fully armored, long spear and shove in a 4. 2 lots of heavy cavalry who are formed similar but average, best cavalry being superior. Supporting them are 4 6s of form flexible, average, unprotected bow, combat shy. 2 of them skilled, 2 of them experienced bow. A unit of D cavalry who are also form close, average, armored horse, fully armored, long spear and shove. Another 4. A 9 of D infantry who are tribal loose, average, protected, short spear. And 2 D Chinese infantry. The first form flexible, average, protected, long spear, and the second being crossbowmen, drilled loose, average, protected, experienced crossbow. I'm a bit puzzled that one's formed and one's drilled. That might be an error somewhere, but we'll better check that. And then the skirmishers are just a unit of skirmisher, average, unprotected, experienced bow, and Cantabrian. And with a poor fortified camp. It's 8 PBS and 4 scouting cards. So
okay, just
to represent a plausible army from that period. Obviously very scary because all the strike cavalry are in 4s, which means you really need to try and use those horse archers first to whittle down the enemy a bit before you commit your cavalry.
I've just quickly dug out the army list. I think those crossbowmen should be formed, Richard, as you suspect.
I wondered, yes.
So no, you can have drilled crossbowmen. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
In fact, for them to be average, they have to be drilled.
Oh, okay.
Actually, the infantry options in the D for the Chinese troops are quite interesting.
Random is what you were
possibly a shade random, but yes, they are in fact drilled. Really not necessarily a bad thing. Anyway. Matt, I'll let you comment first.
It's not my kind of army, but for the period, I think that's a rather nice put together. The cataphractic 4s would give me heart attacks. I'm not skilled enough to keep them out of trouble, which is why I like those kind of things in sixes, because at least when I get in trouble, I can survive long enough to hopefully find my way out of the problem. No, it's yeah. I feel the D is. I can't make my mind up. That's the ally. I don't know. I'm not sure what it brings to the party, because it's a mix of. I can see the D infantry and the Chinese crossbowmen working well together if there's a piece of terrain they can hold. I guess the long spear gives you a good island to anchor the formed horse archers off of, if you don't want to put a heavy cavalry unit up there. No, I take that back. Yes, I can see how it could work, particularly with a talented professional.
Yeah, my main aim was actually to come up with an army that matched one of the battles in history, but there you go.
Well, why not?
If it works on the table, it would be a bonus.
Yeah, I'm with Matt on the heavy cavalry. I can cope with the superior cataphract in a 4. The average ones do worry me. I just think if you had those 4s with Matt's infantry, I think that might work better. But you could be asking the 4s to be the rocks around which the horse archers operate. They could get very much isolated and picked on. Would be my thinking.
Valid comment.
But I mean, if you dropped it to a 9, then you could merge. Well, no, you can't merge, can you? Because you'd have to drop the superiors down to average.
Yeah,
get 2 6s out of that, which is probably not what you want to be doing.
Yeah, it's.
I've got a feeling it might do better in a battle against other historical 16 kingdoms opponents than it might do in a sort of open MEG competition.
Fair comment. Yeah. It is no bad. But as you said, you came with the army based off a battle. So why not? I think fundamentally, I will put my Shi'an kingdoms list up on the blog with the show notes, just so people can see it. But basically, I prefer that one, partly because I include the trained horse archers that the former Yan can have, the tribal close, superior, protected, experienced bow shower shooters, just because they're funny.
You've got to go for them, yeah.
It is. It's a different thing, but otherwise it's similar. Yes. Yeah, it's not ringing my bell, Richard. I have to say. I just think
fair enough.
Yeah, I think. Yes, or no.
No, really, is what you're saying.
Yeah, probably. Probably. I like the horse archers. There's something nice about the horse archers in these 16 kingdoms lists, actually, in that they can be combat shy. You save quite a lot of points that way over the non-combat shy ones, and because on the whole, if those flexible horse archers get into combat, they're probably being beaten up by something that will beat them up anyway. The combat shy is probably not making a lot of difference a lot of the time. Yeah. There's times it does. It is nice sometimes not to have that giving the opponent an extra claim. It turns a flank charge from +4 into +3 effectively.
I think the combat shy is good value for money in those form flexible.
Oh yeah. There's other armies, like that being last weekend. I used a great Seljuk army, and I'd have been very happy for my horse archers in that to be combat shy, just because I had about 30 bases of them, and you pick up a lot of points. You're picking up 300 or 400 points across that.
Yeah.
That's a meaningful amount of points. So it is, yeah. However, we're not so keen on that one, Richard. Sorry.
That's all right.
You went for the
I'll live
historical.
with it. I'm not shattered.
Was that an attempt at a pun as well, Richard? You can't shatter, you've only got shoved with the cataphracts. So anyway, I'll go on to my list. I've gone for the steppe for a Gok Turk, as Richard mentioned. So this is towards the end of the period. This is really the period where the Tang are replacing the Sui. So, and in fact, I've got a Gok Turk with a Sui ally. So it's right at the end. I've got a vague remembrance that the Sui ally was a holdout remnant of the Sui somewhere in a city, somewhere in the north, that allied with the Gok Turk, as the Gok Turks were trying to exploit the civil wars going on in China before the foundation of the Tang. So anyway, this is list 4404, dated at 621 CE. The terrain types are standard and plains, as you might expect for a steppe culture. In fact, the standard doesn't always apply, but the Turks, I think, controlled enough areas with towns and cities in them, so we get that. A poor mobile camp, and so the ally is 4405. So these are from the Tang book, not the Three Kingdoms PDF. So anyway, I have a unit of nobles, cavalry, formed loose, superior, unprotected, experienced bow, short spear, melee expert, 6 bases. A unit of richest nobles who are the same but protected, so it costs a big chunk more. 4 units of horse archers, just like Richard's, form flexible, average unprotected with bow, all 6s. 2 of them are experienced, 2 of them are skilled. The Turks can't downgrade theirs to combat shy though, so I've had to pay the full whack on that. I've got a 5th unit of horse archers. This is just a 4 and is experienced bow. The Sui ally are 2 units of heavy cavalry, which are formed close, average, armoured horse, fully armoured, long spear shove, 2 6s. A unit of conscript spearmen and conscript archers, a mixed unit, 3 bases of each. The spearmen are formed flexible, poor protected, experienced bow, short spear, and the archers are formed loose, poor protected, experienced bow. So they're the sort of Fubing types, but they're conscript, so not very good. And then a unit of specialist crossbowmen, formed loose, average protected, skilled crossbow, and 8 of them. I think it's rather tasty. So my generals, I forgot to mention the generals, are a competent instinctive army commander, talented professional ally, a competent instinctive, and a mediocre instinctive sub-general. I'll just note that if you dropped the Sui skilled crossbowman from an 8 to a 6, the mediocre sub-general, Turkish sub-general, could be a competent instinctive general if you prefer 1 extra card over having 8 skilled crossbowmen. I'm not sure what the right answer on that one is. Anyway, so we've got, I'd like to see this as 3 proper fighting cavalry units, the richest nobles, the 2 Sui heavy cavalry, horse archers to dance around and shoot, and also an infantry unit that's skilled shooters and crossbowmen as well. So it's got the S cause wounds if you're charging at them. PBS of 6, not quite as good as you might hope for, but then again, it's instinctive generals and only a competent, and scouting of 4. Again, not as much as some horse archer armies get, but that's because you've got the cataphracts in there and the 2 infantry units. So there you are. That's my offering. Other end of the period from Matt.
I'm swayed by the ally.
Oh.
I'll get my coat. I'll leave. Genuinely, I like the ally. Well, I actually like the entire list. I've always had a soft spot for this. You run it really well, and yeah, no, that specialist crossbowman just, and in 8s, I definitely would have them in 8s. I think there's a certain satisfaction in having that 4 wide and sat in a piece of terrain, really annoying people. No, yeah. I like it. Even the unprotected nobles are a bit of a giggle as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
they're they're only 138 points a pop.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a bit odd. They boil down to, as long as they're not being shot at, they're actually okay, because in combat the melee expert essentially cancels out the unprotected, so you're superior, if you like, in that situation. But they can be a bit vulnerable if they're shot at, for the obvious reason that they're loose and unprotected. So it's not like the flexible horse archers, who can always opt to go into skirmisher formation to make them a bit more resistant to shooting unless the enemy gets very close. Richard?
Yeah, I have to say, I think I can see where it's coming from as an army to use, and looks quite nice. Yeah, I was sort of reflecting on the superior unprotected, and I think that's quite unusual.
A lot of
either it's an accurate rating, and perhaps a lot more troops should get it in some of the other lists, or else it's you could take the view that it's being a bit harsh against the Gokturks. But
quite a few of the Turkish army, the Gokturks get it. I think the Turgesh get it. I think the Uyghur get it. There's a sort of slew of them. It's classification. It's sort of one of those. I can see where it's coming from. It's nobles leading. It's a smaller number of nobles leading a load of horse archers. I do wonder whether they should be flexible.
I was about to say the same thing.
Yeah,
I wonder if you're going to go unarmored.
But also maybe not the melee expert if you do that.
I don't know. There's quite a tradition of
it's
unprotected nomads being melee experts. So.
Yeah, it depends how fighty you see them as. It's the fact that they're superior as well. It's not like the Hunnic list, where the Huns are melee expert because they were a bit fighty, or we see them as a bit fighty. But they're average, leaving aside their nobles, who are a bit optimistic classification in my view, but I take them over. I feel the
the interesting thing is how that relates to Avars, for example, who may have originally been Turks who fled.
There's
or possibly Ruran who fled.
The suspicion is that the Ruran are, and the Ruran list has a lot more protected cavalry in it.
Indeed,
and so does the Avar list. Again, it's one of those things that maybe at some stage it'd be let's sit down and look at the whole swathe of the steppe horse archer armies, the medieval ones anyway. Because it might be a case of there's inconsistencies which don't stack up in there. But I say, those unprotected ones, they can be very useful. And I say, you get 828 points for the unit. If you don't get it shot at, it's quite handy. If it's shot at, you sort of cross your fingers and
and hope. Yeah.
And hope, really. Yeah.
Actually, what you were talking about that reminds me. I don't know if I can find it. There's who was Chile, actually, dated 678. He actually has models of fully armored cavalry, which is quite interesting, because that's quite a late date for armored cavalry. The Tang seem to, by and large, go with Turkish cavalry and don't seem to have many armored cavalry by this date. So the fact that some nomads were still using armored cavalry is quite interesting. Although admittedly these are more to the northeast than the Gokturks would be.
Yeah. All right. Interesting.
It's just talking about armor reminded me of that.
The step ones. Yeah, I think step ones are. It's tricky because you're looking at a very lots and lots of people are providing their own kit with very little central control, saying thou must turn up with this. So all these hugs are going to be a real mixture of stuff.
It certainly implies the richest nobles, even in the 7th century, certainly in the Manchuria area, were still fully kitted out with horse armor.
That could be interesting. I've got one question that I was sort of list related, which I think we have touched on in conversation, not as part of the podcast before, Richard. It's about the territory choices about these Chinese armies. Some of them don't necessarily stack up. I think actually we were talking about it last weekend. I can't remember.
We were.
It's and whether at some stage they could be revised as to be a bit more consistent or fit with the all those different dynasties on your flow chart. I think southern dynasties are probably okay. They're easy. They're jungle and forest and whatever. It's the northern ones, isn't it?
I mean, first off, it's worth saying we're talking about very big areas.
Oh, yeah.
So you could certainly in the north of China, you definitely have mountains. You definitely probably should have plains, which I don't think occurs on quite a lot with the northern lists. You probably could have standard. And you could argue for the major rivers, you probably could have coastal, because coastal is sometimes used as defined as where we've got a major river.
Yeah, the Yellow River and the Yangtze definitely.
Massive. Yeah, Yellow and Yangtze definitely would qualify as major rivers, which would be justifying a flank. So I mean, arguably you've got standard coastal plains and mountains being valid for northern China. And I mean, if you wanted to get into the north west, you could probably argue desert in places, although you probably don't get many armies in the deserts. South, you can certainly argue again standard coastal mountains and probably jungle or at least forest. Unfortunately the lists only allow for 3 different territory types, but there is certainly an argument that the territory types could be varied in future.
Yeah, I don't think it's exactly a biggie at the moment. It is.
I'm not going to lose a huge amount of sleep over it. Let's put it like that.
I think the one that it's not for this podcast really, but I think it's when I've looked at my Han army, the territory types it gets, it's caused me to scratch my head. I think it's the Han one that always leaves me going, that just seems a bit odd. Anyway, enough. That's something that can be definitely well for a future day. So, okie dokie. We've been talking for quite a while again. Once again, time's flown by. Anything anybody wants to add? I suppose we probably ought to be wrapping up. Matt?
Just to say that the ever-expanding 3D printing world includes some quite nice peripherals around the Chinese, most of them. 10 Kingdoms is worth looking at, as in the model manufacturer, not the 10 Kingdoms themselves, if they exist. For those that are interested in armies for, well, I'm going to say the period, for the Chinese theatre, shall we call it that?
I think they're better for a bit later, aren't they? But they've got some bits and pieces in the files that would do for earlier as well, I'm sure. So, Richard, any other thoughts?
Not on the Chinese. Before we go, I would like to mention that the Society City of Ancients battle will probably have been held Battle Day will have probably been held before this podcast is released. It's actually Sunday the 28th, isn't it? Where are we today?
Yes, it's a weekend.
30th. Sunday's the 30th.
Yes,
30th.
Yes, it's,
Yeah.
it's in 2 or 3 days' time from when we are recording this.
Hermitage Village Hall in Berkshire, Battle of Malden this year. And if anybody MeG playing is there, we will look forward to seeing you.
There you are. Okay, we've got nothing much more to add. I suppose we shall wrap it up there then. I hope that's been interesting for you, the listeners out there, because I think I always had this vague feeling that the Three Kingdoms PDF tends to get a bit overlooked. I don't know why. I don't know what. Maybe I'm completely wrong on that. But people seem to go for the earlier one because things like the Qin army is always popular. I've seen some Han around. I've used Han, and the Tang PDF when you get the Tang and things like the Gokturk. But the Three Kingdoms one seems a bit of a. If somebody picks an army from that, you go, "Oh, that's unusual." But maybe I'm wrong on that.
No, I think it's probably because it's a period the history is not really that well known, so it's a period people don't really think about armies for.
Though Mr. Cummings is quite successful with the Southern Dynasties out of that list, out of that PDF.
Very true.
That's because he likes battle wagons. So.
I wasn't.
It's his single year speciality, and for the podcast listeners out there, I have. I'll put his Southern Dynasties list up as well because he used it quite regularly. He used it at Ice and Fire. Gosh, I beat it. It came off second best to my Daylami. But it's a damn good arm, I have to say.
Yes.
But it is really a 1 year special because I think you can only have the war wagons in 1 year. But it's a goodie.
They're accounted for in one particular campaign.
Yeah, but it's a goodie.
I suspect they may have existed more commonly than that, but
I wouldn't be surprised. I think throughout Chinese history, when Chinese armies have been outclassed in the cavalry department, scrambling, bodging together some sort of war wagon defence has cropped up more than once.
Yes, strategies and tactics were well studied in China, so if they were known about, they were probably available to quite a lot of armies. But
yeah, I think it's so. What was the army list only allows it for 1 year, so we can jest with Paul on that. I think it's probably wider, so it's probably. So it can salve his conscience. Not that apparently it needs salving.
Right.
So that. Okay, chaps. Well, thank you very much, Richard. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for the flow chart, especially just because it is such a complicated period. And thanks for going through it and explaining it, and the ins and outs and all those dynasties, all those kingdoms. And on that note, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll get together again soon and do another one. And hopefully if anybody's got any ideas out there in listener land, drop us a line. We're always open to ideas.